Jennet Siebrits of CBRE. Jen.
Thank you very much. Look, before I start, I really want to apologise. It's probably more of an apology to myself, really. I spent the first 6 months of remote working enviously looking at other people's wonderful studies and their lovely kitchens that they were working out of. So I spent the next 6 months making my new kitchen wonderful and my new study wonderful as well. And today would have been a perfect opportunity to show it off. Unfortunately, I was having the floors varnished in the living room, which leads to the study, and I can't actually get into my wonderful study. So I'm stuck in the teenage den, or AKA the dumping room, which doesn't even have curtains. So I'm so disappointed that I can't show off how I've been trying to support the construction industry. So today I'm going to do a very brief run through for you of property backdrop. So I'm going to start by looking at the wider economic backdrop, and then I'm going to go on to what this actually means for property and have a little look to see what we think it means specifically for property in Cardiff. So, as I say, I'm going to start with the economic prognosis. Well, I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone that we've had a rather interesting time of it over the last year or so. And the economic backdrop has absolutely mirrored the pattern of the lockdowns. Massive reduction in economic growth in the second quarter of last year. Massive upsurge when we were all let out of lockdown. And similarly, this last quarter, we've had a downturn. But as you'll notice from this chart, the downturn that we've had in Q1 this year actually hasn't been as bad as perhaps it could have been, and certainly not as bad as it was in the first lockdown. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, the lockdown hasn't been quite as severe. I mean, if you remember back this time last year, we weren't allowed out at all, and there were no shops and nothing was open. Now, some industries are open. Estate agents, for example, are open, and construction, as I mentioned, is able to carry on. But also it's partly about businesses being a bit more prepared. So, you know, again, last lockdown, all the restaurants, all the cafes, everywhere was shut. It took them about a month, 6 weeks, and they thought, hang on a minute, this is here to stay. And they kind of opened up sort of pop-up takeaway facilities, I suppose you'd say. And actually what could happen this time is that all the systems and processes were in place. And so these pop-up takeaway facilities opened up immediately. So the fall in GDP isn't as harsh as it possibly could. Similarly, we're expecting GDP growth not to rebound, not quite as much as when the last lockdown was lifted. And this is purely because of the fact that the GDP didn't fall so far. So that's kind of the pattern that we're looking for of how the economic growth will continue. What does this mean if we look at it on an annual basis? It means that this year we're expecting economic growth overall of about 4%. Now, you know, a couple of years ago, if you told me we'd have economic growth in 2021 of 4%, I'd have been jumping up and down for joy. But, you know, these are strange times. I mean, and actually, look at 2022, we're forecasting nearly 8% growth. I mean, that's Chinese level growth. You know, we don't get that here. But what it does mean is that we're not going to get back to 2019 levels until sort of mid-end of 2022. And if we just think of that very simply, what does that mean? That means the money that I had in my purse is not going to return at the end of 2029, is going to return to that level by 2022. It's quite an easy way then to think of how people might react and how businesses might react. But we do expect growth to bounce back very, very quickly. We are expecting unemployment to increase. The furlough scheme has done an amazing job at keeping unemployment low. And we are hoping that actually as the economy picks up again, there will be less need for some of the people who are on furlough to go into unemployment. They might go transitorily into unemployment, but hopefully the economy will grow such that there will be other opportunities for them. Now, largely, growth is going to be underpinned by spending. I mean, there is about 150 billion pounds of extra savings over this period, and that extra savings have come from not commuting costs, you know, no haircuts, as you can tell from me, you know, and not buying clothes to go in and out of the office, and of course not going out to eat. And the survey that was done has suggested that there's about 50 billion of this people plan to spend as soon as lockdown is over. And they plan to spend it on a variety of holidays, both foreign and domestic, although I suspect it'll be more towards domestic, and also restaurants and cafes and pubs and bars. This is because people are fed up with being inside. I mean, if I had a Venn diagram that had one circle, which was what I could cook, another circle, which is what my kids will eat, and another circle, which is takeaways, I can tell you that the little bit in the middle is very, very small. And I, for one, can't wait to get out to restaurants just so that I can have something else to eat. And I know that a lot of people want this same. And we think we're going to find this, what we're calling revenge spending, you know, revenge against COVID. We're going to go out and we're going to spend. This is great news. And why is this great news? Is because the sectors that have been hit hardest are hospitality and leisure and retail. And they're the sectors that are going to be boosted by all of this revenge spending. So we do expect the economy to pick up, and we do expect it to pick up proportionally in the areas that have been hard hit, which is why our unemployment forecasts aren't quite as drastic as some other people's are, perhaps. So what does this all mean for property? Well, don't really want to go back over this, but you know, it was a pretty grotty year in 2020. Leasing was down, office leasing was down, and investment across all real estate was down. Although it did pick up at the end of the year as the some of the lockdown restrictions were released. But the thing that was really interesting about investment, particularly, is it varied across different sectors. Hotels investment did really badly. It was down 60%. Resi, on the other hand, institutional investment, student investment, that was up 6%. And logistics up 38%. Normally when we have a downturn, it hits everyone kind of the same, broadly speaking. But of course, there's all these different nuances of COVID. It's not your normal, bog standard, typical downturn. Let's face it, you know, there was no economic reason, if you like, for the downturn. It was a public, a government-led, policy-led recession. And the different restrictions and things have impacted different real estate. So hotels, as I mentioned, really bad. And that's because we're not allowed to travel. There's no corporate events. So that's hit hotels really hard. Retail, people aren't, non-essential shops aren't open. There's no need for us to go out and buy makeup and, and things. So again, retail has been hit really hard. But the counter side to that is logistics, which has really benefited. And of course, data centers have done amazingly well. But, it's not just COVID that has impacted the real estate. Everyone's sitting and say, oh, retail, it's all COVID-led. It's not all COVID-led. I can illustrate this by showing you this chart, which basically uses the CBRE monthly index and shows the downturn in capital values. And we compare the global financial crisis downturn, what was happening, in the post-Brexit era, post-EU referendum era, pre-Brexit, and then in the COVID era. And what I've done is I've done solid lines for each of these areas, but also the dotted line. And the dotted line is retail values. So we look back at the global financial crisis, the impact on retail was broadly the same as all property types. There was really not much in it. But when we look at the other two periods, so the post-Brexit and the COVID, you can see that actually retail values were declining much more dramatically. So even though everyone is saying retail has been hit hard by COVID, it has been hit hard by COVID, but actually things were happening anyway. Things were going on anyway that were impacting retail. And the things that were going on anyway were an increase in online penetration, this pickup in e-commerce growth. This trend had been happening between 2015 and 2019, a steady increase from just over 10% to 20% of the penetration of online, the online shopping. What COVID has done is accelerated the trend. I know that at the beginning of lockdown, you couldn't have got my mother, my 83-year-old mother, to get her shopping from Waitrose, online. Now she's no looking back. She's never going to go into a store again. And because people have had to, particularly the older generation, have had to sort of embrace online shopping. They've embraced it. They've suddenly realised actually it's the setting up of it that's difficult. Once you're set up, it's it's great, it's wonderful. And we do expect that there will be a dip back in online penetration. People do like going to stores. Don't know why, but they do like going to stores. And actually, but we're going to still have this step change. So there is going to be this permanent shift in e-commerce, in online shopping, and this will continue to have an effect on retail real estate. And there are other challenges for, for retail real estate. There've been the talk about the shift to turnover rents, and even given the stores that they, the retailers keep, they're going to have to adapt slightly for, this omni-channel consumer. They're going to have to invest in their online platform, change their stores, maybe bring it a bit into sort of experiential retail. So there's a lot going on for the poor retailers, and they really need to get it right. If they don't get it right, or for the stores they don't want, there is a real opportunity for retail repurposing and repositioning. And there's quite a few other sectors that might gratefully grab up some of the retail stores. And of course, one man's poison is another man's meat. The major beneficiary of the increase in e-commerce is logistics. And we have seen this massive pickup in take-up in logistics and a fall in the availability of logistics. Now, a lot of this has been in rather large logistics units, and that's one area where it's slightly different for Cardiff. A lot of the take-up and the logistics offers in Cardiff is the smaller logistics stores. It's under 100,000 square feet, but that actually is what is becoming the much more in demand now. What we're calling the last mile logistics. Yes, we need these big sheds and these big stores, and Amazon are buying these big, big sheds everywhere. But actually, a lot of the logistics operators now are looking for these kind of hubs in city centres, at the close to city centres, because of course, what's really important to consumers is when they press on that button, they want their delivery the next day. So there could be some opportunities for logistics in that area. We've done an occupier survey. We do these occupier and investor surveys very regularly, and we ask questions of what their intentions are. And on the logistics side, it just goes to reiterate how strong the demand for it is in the market. Nearly 50%, of current logistics occupiers have said they need additional short-term space. A lot have accelerated their online channels and speeded up their expansion plans. And even when we look in the longer term, 50% of logistics occupiers saying they need more flexible storage space, and they need to reinforce their supply chains. So this is an area that's really growing. I mean, there have been, for the first time, there have been some logistics investors that have actually managed to outbid residential investors in certain parts of the country. So this is definitely one to watch. The other area which is really interesting is what's happened to offices. Where I'm working at home, you're all working at home. I mean, in the paper, it seems to be very mixed, now, and it seems to go through peaks and troughs. Everyone wants to work at home. Everyone's fed up with working at home. Some people want to work at home. Some people don't. I mean, the latest was Nationwide Building Society saying that they're going to give all their employees the flexibility to work from home where and where they want. On the other hand, we have the Chancellor saying that employers shouldn't force people to work at home because they will lose their staff, which I think they probably would. It seems to me that there has been a definite pickup in the desire to work on what we would call a hybrid model. So this is people coming into the office, say 3 or 4 days a week, or 2 or 3 days a week, and working at home or elsewhere. It's not just home where people will be working. And this has sparked sort of a bit of angst, shall we say, in office investors, because they're saying, oh, you're telling us that the average days in the office, is going to reduce by 25%. That means demand's going to reduce by 25%. So it's not going to reduce by 25% because it's not about average days worked. It's about the level of occupancy. And of course, employers need to make sure that there are enough seats for all the bums that want to sit on it. And we know that people left to their own devices would tend to come into an office Tuesday, Wednesday, and a Thursday, rather than a Monday and Tuesday, or a Thursday and a Friday. And Wednesday seems to be the peak day that everyone wants to seem to be in the office. But if everyone wants to go into the office on a Wednesday, employers need to make sure that they have enough space for everyone on a Wednesday. That's not going to have any impact at all on their demand for office space. And it just slightly concerned me when I read the Nationwide piece, because they were saying, everyone's getting the freedom, they're getting flexibility, but we're shutting down a couple of offices. And I thought, well, they're going to be in trouble if everyone decides to get into work, go into work on the same day. So I think, we found that in talking to our clients through our workplace strategy team, most employers, about 68%, are going to offer some kind of remote working, but what they're calling remote working with conditions. So they might say, okay, so team A need to go in 1 week, team B the next week, or team A Tuesdays and Wednesdays and team B Thursdays and Fridays, for example, because they need to spread the peak of occupancy, because otherwise they're not going to make any savings. And quite frankly, they're only going to let us work at home if it's financially beneficial for them. So we've done an exercise where we've looked at what this means for office demand. We do think it's going to lead to a one-off 10% fall in office demand. That's assuming that we have a 25% cut in the average days. But of course, it's not going to happen at once. Office leases are spread over time. People can't, occupiers can't break leases all at the same time. So again, we think that this is going to be a trend that happens over 3 or 4 years. And of course, remote working was happening anyway. It's a trend that was happening anyway. And again, as with the kind of e-commerce, we think that what's happened is COVID has actually accelerated the trends. We are now where we would have been in 7 years' time. So this is kind of what COVID has done. It's accelerated all the trends. So we do think that there will be a reduction in office demand, but just, if you just isolate the remote working. But of course, the major thing that demand for offices is based on is office-based employment. And if we think office-based employment is going to go up, it will offset the 10% fall in office demand from remote working. And also, where you've got prime, good quality office stock, that's always going to be more in demand than secondary stock. And so when you've got cities like Cardiff, where they have over time been reducing their secondary office stock, and it's been swapped into student, for example, repurposed into student, the stock that's left, the prime stock that's left, is going to be the stock that's in demand. So you're going to be in a really better position. As I mentioned here, most cities have seen a reduction in take-up over the last year. But what's really interesting, it hasn't all happened to the same degree. London, for example, has fared particularly badly. They've had take-up was under half of what the long-term average. Cardiff's actually fared really well. And the take-up has stayed relatively buoyant, and it's much better than the average, and much better than a lot of the cities here. And again, I think this is because there has been this trend anyway towards the prime stock, keeping the prime stock, upgrading the prime stock. And so you've got this kind of, this dynamic of getting rid of, the poor stock and just keeping the good stock. So obviously the take-up will be able to remain strong. And I show it on this slide. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, vacancy rates in Cardiff at 6.5%. I mean, that's the lowest they've been since 2000, which is amazing. And this is because there is this supply constraint. There was less construction last year. And as I say, the secondary stock has been bought out of circulation. So, Cardiff actually is very well placed going forward, I think, especially in the office arena. So institutional residential, along with logistics, has been a winner. If we look at total investment was down by about 20%. Investment in multifamily housing or build to rent, institutional residential has gone up by about 27%. So, there has been this real shift. It's partly because residential is counter-cyclical, and residential trends, particularly in multifamily housing, don't follow the normal economic cycle. Particularly rental, as the economy is weaker, people tend to go into rental stock rather than to buy. So there's this counter-cyclical nature. And of course, the facetious people would say, even in a downturn, you need somewhere to live. And people tend to prioritize their rent and their mortgages over other bills. So as we can see, rent collection has remained very, very strong. This is for multifamily housing. Rent collection has remained very, very strong, particularly when you compare it with sort of retail assets. And so this is why investors have been really attracted into this sector at the cost, I suppose, or the expense of office and certainly of retail. Hotels, on the other hand, as I mentioned, were down by 60%. What's really interesting, though, is the split. Where the lack of investment has been is in the big portfolios. You know, the single assets, you know, the sort of the hotels on the seafront, the family-owned hotels, they've still traded really well over the last year, and actually, you know, not that far off average. It's just these big portfolio deals that have done really badly. But what is really great is that hotels will be one of the beneficiaries going forward, one of the beneficiaries of the spend. Particularly, you know, there is all this talk about are people going to get foreign holidays? Are they not? You know, we know that a lot of people are still a bit anxious about going away, and there's big drive towards staying domestically. Just, you know, A, for their own safety, and B, you know, the travel industry didn't exactly cover themselves in glory last year when people had to change flights, you know, and cancel flights, and you know, a lot of people spent a lot of time waiting for their refunds from the airlines, etc., and the hotels, and quite often was said, well, actually, we're not going to give you a refund, we're just going to give you your booking another time. And so I think there's been a little bit of, you know, the travel industry is going to have to do a little bit to get the trust back. So you know, I think the winners are going to be the more budget, but you know, domestic hotels, and particularly the regional hotels, seaside hotels, Welsh hotels, I think are going to do very well. These typical areas which people want to go on holiday to, quite frankly. London won't do well because, of course, it's very reliant on international tourists. And you know, and if I'm going on holiday in the UK, I'm certainly not going to go to London. I'm going to go to somewhere, you know, really nice like the Gower. It doesn't look like it's bringing up my, there, it's bringing my circles up there now. Phew. One of the things that we've looked at here is we've tried to ascertain which areas will perform best when people are resurging in hotel spend. And so what we've looked at is we've looked at sort of areas where they have a high share of leisure nights, so domestic leisure nights, and also, you know, this high share of domestic nights. And also we've looked at pipeline. It's quite complicated stuff's gone into this chart, so I'll just explain it very simply. If you're in green, it's thumbs up for the hotel industry in that area. If you're in red, it's thumbs down. If you're in orange, you're doing pretty well. And the reason that I wanted to show this to you is because, you know, we've analysed actually Cardiff is one of the mid performers. It's going to do fairly well out of the resurgence in hotel spend. So that's really, really good news. So very near to the end now, so I just wanted to just give you a little bit of our what do we think is going to go forward. So we forecast total returns. We base this on MSCI data, and we look at the four major sectors: residential, institutional residential, not to be confused with what Lawrence is going to talk about shortly, and industrial, retail, and offices. And average annual returns over the next 5 years. If you're going for total returns, you want to plump in residential or industrial, because average over the next 5 years, you know, between them about 7% per annum over the next 5 years. Retail, on the other hand, is really at the bottom in the doldrums at less than 2%. We do expect investment to pick up, and we expect that investment will be broadly at about 2018 levels in 2022. So that's the kind of trajectory that we are expecting. And my final slide is just a kind of a summary slide, just to sort of leave with you some of the real estate challenges that we are going to face. I haven't talked about Brexit at all. There will be some long-term impacts from supply chains, although it would appear at the moment that the supply chain issue is more surrounding whoever was driving the boat in the Suez Canal. Apparently that's going to cause about 3 weeks worth of a backlog in supply. I haven't really spoken about switches to assets like life sciences. You know, I don't know if you read this morning that we should all expect a revaccination in October. So I wonder whether, you know, the new real estate sector is going to be drive-through vaccination centres. You know, that could be something to watch. Town centre revival. You know, the recent changes to sort of planning guidelines and things will really help boost town centre revivals, you know, and retail repurposing. You know, if we can really get this right, we can use this as an opportunity. You know, we don't want to get rid of all our retail. We want to, you know, to have some retail there. One of the trends that has come out of COVID, which I think is really interesting and is really nice, and I know people don't like the word nice, but it's really nice, and that is that, you know, the increase in community and the kind of, you know, wanting to buy locally. You know, and maybe, you know, retail can really kind of latch around that, and, you know, we can have some, you know, local sustainable shops to help support our high streets. We do think that there will be conversion of some retail parks into urban logistics hubs. I spoke about that earlier. And there will be maybe demand for secondary locations. If people are working from home more, we may find that these locations that were secondary before actually start becoming prime. Of course, key to finalise, my final thing I'm going to say is always we see a flight to quality. And I think this is one of the reasons why we can, if you've got lots of prime stock in your city, like you have in Cardiff, you will be much better positioned to weather the storm or the remaining part of the storm. So that's me. So thank you very much.
Jen,
happy to answer some questions.
Yep, sorry. Thank you very much indeed. You covered a huge amount of ground, the full waterfront, and you brought out across virtually every single area that this time of great pause has also been a time of a great acceleration of pre-existing trends in many cases. I want to give you two hypotheses and see what you think of each of these. The first you've made clear is that Cardiff particularly is supply constrained. And in classic economic theory, if supply is constrained, demand being at least level, value will go up. Do you think that's underpinning some of your expected optimism in property values across the piece in Cardiff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is, it will take time to come forward. We know that, leasing activity is still very low. We expect it to stay low at the moment. There is this still underlying uncertainty, but we do expect that people will come forward and that lease activity will start to pick up, and we'll start to see some yield compression.
And the other part is that property isn't a zero-sum game, but it's quite close to it in some respects because of that supply issue or availability issue. In other words, if there's very big demand, as you've made very eloquently clear, amongst logistics companies and storage in particular, that is going to encroach on the overall stock and availability elsewhere. And so their valuation potentially will be higher on those areas. But equally, if you constrain the supply elsewhere, that will also further help underpin robustness of the sector.
Yeah, I mean, and the only way to get around this is we need to develop more, and we need, it's because you're right. We can't just have one sector offsetting another sector. If we want to grow, it's great that we can have logistics offsetting another sector at the moment, while there is, the demand isn't equal. But what we need to make sure going forward is that we don't just have rising prices. Is that actually the supply response comes forward, because you want the supply response to come forward to stop massively rising prices.
And on one particular sector you've touched on, retail, that this massively increased trend towards e-commerce. Can you talk about the effect of that specifically on retail property values?
Yeah, I mean, we expect that values are going to fall. I mean, our monthly index has been showing that capital values in retail has declined over the last 3 or 4 years, and we're expecting this to continue. And in fact, over about an 8-year period, from 2 years ago going up another 6 years, we are expecting retail capital values to fall by about 50% in total. So it is quite a significant fall. We do think this will lead to some repurposing, and of course then the supply and demand imbalance will start to pick up. And retailers have got to start being clever, and they are starting to be clever. We hear about all this experiential, retail. I mean, I think it's in Dubai where there's the shopping centre where it's got a shark in the middle of it and things. I'm not suggesting that we go quite that extreme.
Why not?
Well, I suppose it's one angle. But I would suggest that we need to start thinking cleverer and giving consumers a reason, I suppose, to get out there. And we saw it over the last 20 years when we've had shopping centres which have developed where they've had cinemas. When I was growing up, you didn't have a cinema in a shopping centre, you had shops in a shopping centre, but now you've got cinemas and bowling alleys, and it's all about getting people into shopping centres. And we need to think about doing more of that to encourage consumers back into shopping centres.
Well, when I was growing up, I'm not even sure there were shopping centres. So there we go. One last thought for you is this. If you've got all these macro and micro trends interplaying as you've expressed and explained, doesn't that lead the thought for investors, if they can, that the safest haven in property is a plural portfolio, mixed usage and so on, because sectors will rise, fall and so on, but spreading it across sectors may actually be the best both defensive but even offensive investment strategy?
Absolutely. I mean, diversity is great in all aspects of life, but particularly in property, you want a diverse portfolio. But, you know, this is why we're finding, you know, multifamily housing has had so much attraction, because it's got very stable returns that don't fluctuate as much with the economic cycle. So it's a good defensive hold to have. You know, similarly, you know, if logistics and retail are kind of balancing off each other. So absolutely, you know, we would always recommend that, you know, a fund or would diversify across different assets.
Well, we're going to have to close here, but a couple of things in closing. Firstly, your presentation will be on the Cardiff Property Awards site, and also the recording of this session will be subsequently on YouTube. So there's a lot to pore over here, and I would absolutely recommend that people do, because there's such value to be had. But the last point, of course, is to thank you very much, Jennet Siebrits of CBRE, for the wisdom and insights that you brought to us today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks. Let's move on, if we may, to Lawrence Bowles at Savills. He provides market intelligence and strategy advice, contributes to Savills' highly regarded house price and rental forecasts. External clients range from investors, national, local government, property management companies, and housing associations. We asked him to analyse the trends during 2020 and into this year, both nationally, regionally, and then within Cardiff, and to project forwards. And that's pretty hard to do, but we're delighted to say that he's stepped up effortlessly to this challenge. Here's Lawrence. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's very kind of you indeed to say that our forecasts are highly regarded. I think generally speaking, talking to people across the industry, they're certainly regarded. But we're doing our best to maintain our status, maintain our reputation for being the least wrong, which is about as good as it gets when it comes to real estate. I'm going to talk through a few things today, as you've already kindly mentioned. We're going to talk through what's been going on over the course of 2020, just to try and get an idea of where we are as things stand at the moment, before we use that as a foundation to look ahead as at our forecasts for the property market, for the residential market, and specifically with a little bit of sort of a focus on the land market as well, to work out where that next round of sites, where that next round of development and house building is going to come from. So taking a look first at sort of what's been going on through 2020, it is certainly been a year. And I thought I'd take this opportunity just to sort of whiz through some of the events of the last sort of 12 or 13 months or so. I'd like to cast your minds back, if you wouldn't mind, to the end of 2019, in fact, when we saw essentially this. We saw a general election result, fairly comprehensively bringing the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson into a strong majority and overall control of the Parliament in Westminster. It was the end of uncertainty. There was no more Jeremy Corbyn risking, in higher levels of property taxation. There was no more uncertainty about what was going on there. Brexit was done. Everything was going to be certain, and we had nothing else to worry about whatsoever. Didn't quite turn out like that, unfortunately. We very quickly transitioned from that period of certainty to a pandemic racing its way across the country very rapidly entering lockdown, and the streets of cities across the UK running completely empty. And the only trips that we were making out being those once weekly trips to the doorstep to clap the NHS. Now, things started to look up as the year went on. We saw Rishi Sunak come in, or Rishi Dishy Sunak, as he's called here, because of the number of dishes he's always carrying, bringing both support for the housing sector in the form of various stamp duty and land transaction tax holidays, but also in the form of Eat Out to help out, to get people back up and coughing all over each other in restaurants again. But as I mentioned, that transaction tax really having a specific and targeted impact on what's been happening in the residential market. Of course, following on from that, we saw a return to lockdown. We've been dipping in and out of lockdown ever since, but with the prospect of vaccines to help ease the recovery as we move ahead. And so the prospects looking on from now, looking a little bit more optimistic than where we were at any point last year. So I thought I'd just take that overview as a bit of an opportunity to put things into context, into just how precipitous that drop was in the economy last year. And this chart, rather beautifully illustrated by the person taking a dive right behind it. That chart shows the amount of economic output that the UK is pumping out every month. And you can see there the rate at which that dropped in the middle of 2020 was far greater than anything ever previously recorded. It dwarfs the global financial crisis in particular. And as Jen's already mentioned with the sort of her sort of economic overview, and we've seen that concentrated effect, particularly in those fields that are most reliant on people traveling and being out and about. So arts and entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and so on, seeing the greatest falls by some margin. Now that's had an impact on people's ability to either to save up for a deposit to be able to make their rental payments, or their confidence in going out to buy a home. And so that has had directly there an impact on what's been going on in the residential market. And so it's left us in a position where, you know, the economy's fallen pretty substantially. For the first time ever, however, and this is the only time as far as we're aware that this has happened, we've seen the economy moving in one direction and the housing market moving in the other. Normally, when you see economic downturns, you tend to see the housing market falling with it. That's not happened this time around, and there's a variety of reasons we think maybe to do with that. Partly is that we've not seen such high levels of price growth in the period leading up to that. We didn't see very much price growth, particularly in the few years before the downturn we saw last year. It's also been in a very low, ultra low interest rate environment, which means that mortgage finance has remained relatively affordable through that crisis. And the broadly, at least, there was this expectation that it was all going to be over very quickly. We even had the immortal line, "It'll all be done by Christmas," which I think, you know, quoting Haig is probably not the wisest thing given the context of that original statement. So perhaps we should have expected something a little bit longer lasting in the first place. But as well as that sort of expectation that things would be over quickly, we also had an unprecedented level of support from government and from the central bank there, supporting jobs through the furlough scheme, supporting people's earnings through various schemes to support the self-employed, and of course the stamp duty, land transaction tax holidays to support the housing market in particular. We've also seen an unprecedented level of forbearance from the mortgage lenders, in particular for people who are feeling that level of distress, who are no longer able or are finding it more difficult to make their mortgage payments. They've had a much greater degree of wiggle room than ever before, certainly by contrast to the global financial crisis. So we haven't seen that same pressure on homeowners in the way that we've seen in previous downturns, and there's certainly not been nearly the same level of forced sales as we've seen in previous downturns, helping to maintain that positive pressure on price growth. So that's left us in this rather odd position. On the one hand, you've got younger households in particular who've been struggling. They're more likely to have been made redundant. They're more likely to have been furloughed and had their incomes attacked, sort of affected by furlough. But on the other, you've got more wealthy, more established households who've increased their savings as a result of being shut up at home and not going to restaurants and going to shops as often, who are now looking to take advantage of those various tax holidays. They're looking to move home, perhaps to find somewhere a little bit larger, perhaps with a little bit more outdoor space, and making these decisions on the basis of reassessing their housing needs, having spent so long shut up indoors at home, rather than the sort of underlying economic essentials that may have driven their decision making previously. So that left us with house price growth at 7.3% at the end of 2020, according to the Nationwide. Presumably, they will be maintaining their forecast and their house price tracking, given that they're all going to be working from home. They can keep a much closer eye on it. But we've also seen a very strong increase in the level of transaction activity, with transactions in December running over a third more than they were in the previous year. And that, as a reminder, already a strong month, already strong performance in December 2019, because of that sort of general election relief, as we saw a much more certain, or what we thought was going to be a much more certain outlook from that point. It's a much more mixed picture on the rental market. And there we've seen a much greater level of divergence, particularly driven, as I mentioned, by those younger households who've been more likely to be made redundant. 2/3 of the jobs lost as a result of COVID were lost by those people aged under 25. And so there, much greater pressure on rental affordability from those younger households who are much more likely to be in the rental market. So we've taken a little bit of a look at sort of what impacts that's had, and certainly we mentioned on the last slide that increase, that very, very large increase in the level of transaction activity. Where that transaction activity has been increasing varies very strongly across the whole country. And if you look at this map to the right here of Great Britain, you can see there that increase in transaction activity very strongly concentrated, particularly in London's hinterland in the south and the east of England, relatively low increases in activity in Wales and in Scotland in particular, that being, we believe, a result particularly of the harsher and longer lasting lockdown restrictions present in these areas. But also just looking at where things have been performing in terms of price points, we've seen a much greater increase in activity towards those middle and higher price bands, sort of £300,000 plus, a relatively muted increase in transaction activity when you look at the sort of £100,000 to £200,000 mark, because of that increase, that saving that you're getting from that LTT holiday, from that stamp duty holiday, is much lower at those lower price bands. That doesn't mean that transactions haven't been increasing significantly, however. And if we look at the number of completed transactions reported by HMRC, these numbers came out Wednesday this week, I believe. There you can see it's been an incredibly strong start to the year. We saw transactions in Wales hit 6,000 in February. That's 56% higher than the 5-year average. It is around 48% higher than the same time last year. And it's by, as far as we can tell, the strongest February on record, certainly the strongest level of a transaction activity in the last 15 years. Part of that will be an acceleration, that will be a rush of exuberance as people rush to beat that LTT holiday deadline, and that was originally in March. We could expect to see a much more prolonged period of higher activity rather than the spike that we'd previously anticipated, given the extension there, both to LTT in Wales and also to stamp duty more generally in England and Northern Ireland. So that's been the impact on transaction activity. If we look at prices, and you can see there that on average, prices across the UK increased by 8% in the year to January, according to the ONS, according to the Land Reg Index. They were up by 9.6% in Wales, outperforming the average there. And in particular, if we dig down into some sort of more local markets, you can see some divergence even within that. If you look at Cardiff, for instance, prices increased by just 4%. I say just 4%, as if that's not already a relatively high level of price growth, particularly in the context of the last few years. But in comparison, if you compare that to Swansea and Newport there, you've seen growth much closer, much more in line with the broader Wales average, in the order of around 8%. And just across the river in Bristol, again, price growth in the order of 8%. To a large degree, we believe that's a reflection of property types. And in general, we have seen a much stronger performance in houses as a typology, and a relatively muted performance in terms of flats over the last 12 months, particularly driven by that experience of lockdown and the desire for more space as our homes become not just places to live and to lay our heads, but also places to work, places to school our children, places to work out. That desire for additional space has really risen up the agenda. So that's sort of taken us up to the latest data in that sense. Looking ahead, well, whether it's a stamp duty holiday or an LTT holiday, that certainly seems to be the factor that's likely to characterize the market over the next few months. There is nothing like a pre-announced stamp duty or pre-announced transaction tax measure to get the market into a spin. And if you look there, and this is looking at transaction activity over the last few decades, you can see there the sheer excessive magnitude of that spike in transaction activity in March 2016, when the Chancellor announced that there was going to be an additional 3% surcharge on transactions for buying additional homes. Now, this is not the whole market. This is just buy-to-let investors and second home buyers. They make up a relatively small proportion of the market. The scale of this spike in transactions we're anticipating when this holiday that's coming to an end affects the whole of the market, we would expect to be, at least of a similar order of magnitude, and that extension of that holiday sort of supporting the grounds for a much more elevated level of transaction activity over the course of this year. I'm not going to dwell too long on this slide because it is showing, I believe, pretty much exactly the same data that Jennet showed in her slides earlier. But we do have one additional line, which is very important to understand in terms of what's going to happen in the residential market over the next few years. And that is that very boring, very flat orange line, which is the central bank base rate. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule. As we've probably discovered, as you probably discovered to your detriment talking to banks, they're not tied exclusively to the base rate when it comes to setting their own interest rates for mortgages or savings accounts and so on. But as a general rule, it's a pretty good indicator of where interest rates are likely to end up. I mean, this does suggest that the cost of borrowing is likely to remain very low consistently over the next 5 years. We're only anticipating the first rises in interest rates towards the middle of 2024. And that means for people who are borrowing money with a mortgage, who are buying homes with a mortgage, that affordability is likely to remain relatively, is going to be eased by that low interest rate environment for the period of certainly for the next 4 years, and to some degree to the 2025 as well. So that, in spite of the short-term economic woes that we've seen there, and the the rises in unemployment that we're seeing reported, over the longer term, we would expect to see that counteracted by affordability being eased somewhat, by interest rates being somewhat lower, mortgage costs being quite a bit lower. So on that basis, and sort of on the basis of the various policy announcements, originally this year, we were predicting that 2021 was going to be a year in 3 parts. There would be a period of exuberance in the first part of the year as people rushing to beat various tax holidays and driven to some degree by that experience, that frustration of life under lockdown. And when originally we were predicting that would be followed by a lull in activity over the second part of the year, the hangover from that tax holiday coming to bear, but also that holiday ending at a time when originally we were expecting to see unemployment hitting its peak. So really sort of a perfect storm of all the different measures there. And that in turn followed by the third part of the year when you've seen the vaccine rolled out, unemployment falling again, interest rates still very low, and generally a switch there to sort of the longer term fundamentals of affordability and economic growth driving the residential market. That was where we were sat before, and then Rishi Sunak had to come out and mess things up again. So we've had to redo our slides, and effectively what that appears to have done on the one hand is that we've seen the stamp duty and the LTT holidays extended, and also the furlough scheme extended, helping to support the market, support that first part of the year, extending that through to the middle of the year. And also we've seen a vaccine rollout program that's going bizarrely for government schemes appears to be going according to plan, and we've not yet seen gigantic delays, which doesn't suggest that we're going to see that part 3 of the year come somewhat earlier than we'd originally anticipated, which suggests that we could expect to see relatively strong activity both in price growth and in transaction activity through the whole of the year, rather than this lull in the middle as we'd expected previously. So that brings us to our forecasts. I've shown all our different regional forecasts for the next 5 years in terms of capital values here, but of course I've highlighted Wales, and you can see there we're expecting recovery to the tune of 3.5% over the course of 2021. I say recovery as if price growth hasn't already been very strong in Wales, so continued growth of around 3.5% in Wales this year, and stronger growth through 2022 and 23 as we see both that sort of return to normal in terms of the economy, in terms of economic output, and in terms of unemployment falling back to more comfortable normal levels. That puts us in a space there where we're expecting price growth to be about 23% over the next 5 years. Again, that's driven relatively high up on the spectrum of regions there, driven by housing being already relatively affordable in Wales. There's a lot more stretch, there's a lot more wiggle room in terms of loan to income ratios and in terms of what people can afford on their mortgage repayments when they've been stress tested by the banks when they're going through the mortgage application process, which suggests that there's greater opportunities, there's greater potential for growth there. I'm going to wrap things up shortly, but I thought I'd talk briefly through the prospects for house building in over the next few years as well, and just sort of look through some of the obstacles, some of the challenges that the market's been facing, and what that might mean for the market. So if we're looking at what house builders are talking about and what they're complaining about, as always, and it should come as no surprise at all, we're finding that developers are complaining most about planning delays being the biggest obstacle to delivery. More than half of developers reporting that as their greatest obstacle to delivering more homes. Now that perhaps shouldn't come as a surprise. Planning officers are a difficult bunch at the best of times. They're even more difficult when you're trying to meet them over Zoom. And if you're trying to combine that with planning committee hearings sort of taking place online as well. I'm not sure if you had the chance to see the Handforth Parish Council discussions, but that sort of gives you an indication of what the typical council meeting is like. That may explain why these delays are being quite so widely reported. For now, at least, we're not seeing labour availability or labour shortages, labour costs being reported as major obstacles to delivering more homes. That's reassuring to some degree, although we may see those factors rising up the agenda as we see country continuing to come out of lockdown and the restricted flow of workers from the EU as a result of Brexit having finally been sort of ratified and done and dusted. And we have, of course, seen a much greater number of developers reporting the availability of materials and particularly land when it comes to obstacles to delivering more homes. And that's had an impact on what we've been reporting in our land value index as well. So every quarter we have the delightful task of going out to talk to our network of land agents across the country, asking them various questions about the state of the market. Are values up or down? Have you seen more or fewer bids than last quarter? And you can see here the results of some of those questions. We've seen, generally speaking, very few of those land agents reporting distressed sales. There's very limited evidence of distress in the market. Although if you ask them, there is still significant numbers of buyers who are convinced that there must be distressed sales out there somewhere, and if they just ask the question enough times, maybe somebody will sell them something cheap. So as a result of that, we've seen very limited pressure on land value as well. So land values there remain, as a result of that, remaining relatively stable. However, we are seeing higher levels of bids being placed than in previous quarters, and new sites, landowners feeling the confidence there to launch new sites onto the market. However, we are seeing deferred payment terms and more cautious payment terms being negotiated there as a result of the sort of economic and more general uncertainty that we're seeing as a result of COVID. And that sort of brings us to sort of what's been going on in the land values. You can see here those three lines looking at what's been happening. We've seen relatively limited falls in land values across the UK. Greenfield land values down by about 0.6%. Urban land values essentially flat. And in the West, that's covering the West Midlands and Wales, we've seen land values there, Greenfield land values there falling by about 0.7%, although they are recovering quarter on quarter. So I'm going to very quickly wrap things up there. Of course, we've seen that the land transaction tax holiday has supported house prices in Wales, and more broadly, that stamp duty holiday has supported pricing across England and Northern Ireland as well. That's been part of the reason that we've seen such acceleration in the level of transaction activity, supported in turn by that experience of life under lockdown and people's dissatisfaction with their current homes. We're forecasting that prices will rise by about 23% over the next 5 years in Wales as a result of all of that and the support that we're seeing through low interest rates. And in terms of development market, the availability of land remains a key constraint, but that's helping to support land values, and particularly strategic land values appear to be holding steady. That wraps things up from me. I'm sure, or I'm hoping that we're going to have a great deal many questions from all of you. So please do pitch in.
Thank you, Lawrence. We're rather constrained on time, unfortunately. And just to say, we will be opening the hubs at 3 o'clock as planned. I'll take a couple of questions before, if I may. You've made a very clear case of the 23% rise over the next 5 years. But to pan the camera out a little bit further, why is it, do you think, that South Wales, Cardiff, and then the wider Southwest England area specifically continues to outstrip other areas for property values?
I think it's a nice thing about working in residential is that it's not purely about the economics. So part of it is talking, pointing to these regions and saying, yes, the economics work, the affordability is less stretched there than it is in other parts of the country. You can get more, mortgage borrowing is relatively comfortable. But it's also just these places are quite nice. And certainly the experience of lockdown in London and living in a flat in lockdown has driven a lot of people to look further out of major cities for leafier locations that have got, where you can get more house for your money, and it's easier to get out of the countryside to enjoy that outdoor space. So that's gonna will have been a real sort of benefit for Wales and the wider Southwest. We'd expect that to continue to do so.
And that capital from capital, London money to this wider, broader area, that's been a factor for years. But would you expect that to be increased as partly for the reasons you've indicated?
We'd expect, so we've seen a very limited flow of people out of London, and we think that's essentially a one-time thing, a one-time phenomenon, in that you've got those people who were living in the city, living in London. They were sort of looking at the housing situation and thinking, maybe I'll move in the next 2 or 3 years. And COVID's come along and they said, stuff it, I'm going now. So that's had a real sort of step change impact on the number of people looking to move out, and that conveyor belt very much accelerating, bringing a lot of people from London and that sort of region to places like Wales, to Bristol, to the broader South Wales area.
And the sort of forced diaspora, I suppose, of larger organisations, including governmental organisations, moving out from the capital to the regions, of course, including Cardiff. And there's a very big initiative to attract all different types of businesses to Cardiff. Presumably that's going to have a further positive effect Is that sort of baked into your numbers, or is it too difficult to call at this stage?
No, it's very much baked in, albeit the impact we tend to find is that when you see people moving, when you see companies moving offices out, you tend to get as much of an impact from new jobs being created in those locations as it is. You don't tend to see, it's not a one-for-one people shifting from one location to the other. A lot of the growth there comes from those new jobs being generated. So, but either way, it's fantastic news in terms of the economic growth of the region. And as as we've seen previously, you tend to see house prices increasing the fastest in areas that are connected to high value employment centres. So the greater job concentration you see there, the more positive the impact.
And just in closing, this year of all years has been the most difficult to forecast, I would imagine, which in a sense almost creates a premium to your own value or to your organization's value. But even with the caveats about the nature of forecasting, even with your determinedly low bar, very self-effacingly low bar of what was it, we aim to be the least wrong. Given all of that, your forecasts are, in broad terms, very positive. Summing up in non-technical language, is it happy days for Cardiff? Is that what looms?
I think you've got to say we've faced unprecedented challenges over the last 12 months, but we've also seen unprecedented levels of support from government and an unprecedented rise in the number of people who've sort of spent so much time at home that they've really faced that reassessment, that reevaluation of their housing priorities, and that is going to have a pretty substantial impact on the market and people's desire to move, people's desire to upsize, and the value that people place on their homes. So that I think you can quite safely say is going to have a very positive impact on the market in Cardiff and in Wales more generally.
Well, there we have it. I'm sorry to truncate the questions, and I know we've had quite a few, but we have got the rest of the symposium to go through. Lawrence, I would like to say on our behalf as organisers, of everyone watching, thank you ever so much for your wisdom and your insights and your thoughtfulness and the time, of course, you've taken on this. And as with Jen as well, you sort of bookended each other from commercial and residential perspectives. And I think you've given us all very profound insights. Those insights will be on the Cardiff Property Awards website. They will also be contained within the YouTube broadcast of this subsequently. Lawrence from Savills, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.